Hey everyone, this is Lomi, and this past week I've been working on a project that seemed really determined to go wrong. I've wanted to make some new eyes for Laylee for a while, since she's never had a good pair. Lately I've seen a lot of really cool doll eyes with more interesting, almost realistic texture in the iris, and naturally I thought, I want to do that. I figured the fastest way to make it happen would be to make new eye bases with textured irises, and then cast them in resin. I made my own eye bases and molds a long while back, so I got out one of the silicone molds and pressed some air-dry clay into it to get a copy of the mold that would be easy to alter. After these bases dried, I stuck more clay into the irises to add the texture. It was surprisingly hard to get the clay to stick, and I put in way too much at first. So I rubbed some water on the bases to reactivate the clay, and that seemed to help. I spent a lot of time scraping out the excess clay before it got to a point where I could use my set of dental tools to make texture. I used the metal picks to create grooves and indentations spiraling out from the center. It took a few tries before the irises weren't overflowing with clay that made it hard to shape anything. Eventually, though, it seemed like it was going together okay. I used a dotting tool to create a circular dent in the center where the pupil would go. I figured I could either paint the pupil or stick to using small beads, depending on what I wanted for each individual pair of eyes. I wanted a variety of texture options, so I tried some other tools and methods too. I found using the rubber head on one of the dental tools let me poke into the clay and create some really interesting dimension that I liked a lot. Once I added the lines and ridges on top of these, this base was my favorite because of how rich the texture was. This seemed like it was going to be perfect for the more realistic irises I wanted. The texture would let me work in lots of colors. Once I was done shaping them, I sanded down the bases to make sure they were smooth, and then used the last bit of mold-making rubber I had in a box. This is where things started to go wrong. The mold rubber looked fine when I poured it, but either the base or the catalyst had expired. And when I went to demold the eyes the next morning, I discovered it hadn't cured at all, and the bases were floating in this uncured slime. Even worse, they had absorbed moisture from it, and the bases were swollen and misshapen. I cleaned them with rubbing alcohol to the best of my ability and let them dry overnight before I tried my backup plan, which was some mold putty that's even older than that mold rubber I had on hand. Fortunately, this amazing mold putty really is amazing, and even though it's several years old now, it worked perfectly. I shaped them into long, pointy pieces that I pressed directly down into the iris and then smushed down over the eye base to ensure I got a seamless fit. But the first round of molds failed, because that uncured rubber gunk hadn't come out of the textured irises all the way, and it kept the putty from curing. I cleaned the eye bases again, and then remade the molds with more putty. After the second time, they turned out okay. Or at least two of them did. The only disadvantage to the putty is that it's not as precise as liquid pourable silicone, so most of the texture I loved was gone. Even so, I'd come this far, so I mixed some resin and poured a few test casts. Once it cured, I discovered one of the molds hadn't cured properly this time either. So one of the test casts was full of yellow gunk it had pulled out of the mold. What a waste. The other two looked okay, if a bit warped from the bases having swollen and deformed when they went for a swim. But I'd decided that I'd gone this far, so I would go ahead and paint. The next issue I encountered was that because I hadn't left any kind of ridge on the edge of the iris, it was super hard to paint these neatly. I couldn't get the irises to stay round because I was basically trying to freehand a circle on top of the eye bases. I wanted these to be a dark golden brown, so I started with gold and then added in brown paint. But the texture on the eyes, which was the whole point and what I liked so much, made it impossible to blend the paint smoothly. So they ended up looking really blotchy and awful. I don't know why this project just didn't want to work. I felt like there had to be a better way to get texture, and a friend suggested I try an eye making method where you fill a normal style eye base with paint, and let it dry until it's dry to the touch, but soft enough to leave indentations. Right away, the problem I had with this was that I used way too much paint, which meant as soon as I poked it, I broke the skin of cured paint on top, and a bunch of uncured paint squished out. I scraped out the extra and carried on. And this actually worked really well. I got really deep, rich texture really easily, though it was hard to see what I was doing when I had to keep stopping to remove wet paint. To add more dimension to these, instead of trying to blend paints, I rubbed in some pearl powder with a brush. Then I added the half beads for pupils. It was only when I added resin to make the dome that I discovered the problem with this method, which was that there was so much texture in the irises that the irises filled with bubbles when the clear resin was added. I struggled to get all the bubbles out, but the domes still ended up filled with bubbles, down in the irises and with micro bubbles all through the cornea. On the other hand, the textured bases didn't seem to face this problem to the same extent. I had a few bubbles, but not like the others. And even though the paint didn't blend well, these ended up looking more realistic and had a much prettier texture. If I could figure out the blending and how to keep the edges of the iris neat, I think these would be the way to go. This one is actually my favorite of the batch. Even though the paint texture was rich in the other ones I made, it kind of disappeared once the dome went on, because the dome magnifies everything, and that big texture was just too much, and it became totally overwhelming when magnified. In the end, I didn't get any usable eyes out of this project, which took me the better part of 2 weeks. This stuff definitely isn't as easy as it looks when other people do it. But I think I'm on the right track for some awesome textured eyes. But maybe next time I'll just buy pre-made textured bases. But that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.